Welcome to the program.
Thank you, David.
The summer of 2010 was one of the bloodiest in Indian-administered Kashmir. It was the summer of the stones and the stone throwers. You've been going to Kashmir and writing about it. What are those stones saying, and who are the stone throwers?
Well, I guess we should qualify the bloodiest, because obviously it's been a very bloody time since the early 90s for the people of Kashmir, and we know that something like 68,000 have been killed. But this summer, the difference I think was that having somehow strangled the militant uprising of the early 90s and convinced itself that under the boot of this military occupation, what the Indian government likes to call normalcy had returned, and that it had somehow managed to co-opt the groovy young people into coffee shops and radio stations and TV shows, and as usual, powerful states and powerful people like to believe their own publicity, and they believed that they had somehow managed to break the spine of this movement. And then suddenly, for 3 summers in a row, there was this kind of street uprising, which would, in a way, what happened over the last 3 summers was like Tahrir Square in Egypt over and over again, without a neutral army, with a security force that was actually not showing restraint, and shooting into the crowds and so on. So what we saw is a sentiment for freedom, which keeps expressing itself in different ways. And this way was difficult, I think, for an establishment that has geared itself now over the last 20 years. It's entrenched itself and geared itself to deal with militancy and some sort of armed struggle, was now faced with unarmed young people, armed only with stones, and all this weaponry that the Indian government has poured in there, didn't know what to do with those stones, coupled with the fact that one of the other great weapons of the Indian occupation has been the manipulation of the Indian media, and that was like a big noisy dam of misinformation, and that was breached with the new techniques of Facebook and Twitter and so on, so YouTube. So the stories were coming out, and so these were 2 new things that the Indian government was faced with.
Kashmir is crisscrossed with a grid of camps, interrogation centers, prisons, guard posts, bunkers, watchtowers. It has now earned the dubious distinction of being the most militarized zone in the world. People like you and I are somewhat privileged. We go there for a while and come out. But what is living under occupation like for Kashmiris?
Well, I think the good thing is that now Kashmiris have begun to write and speak about that themselves, so I don't think it needs someone like me to really tell that story, because like you said, we don't know that story from personal experience. You and I are not the people who would be stopped and humiliated at a checkpost, but quite often I keep wondering, about the fact that, of course, the human rights reports and the newspaper stories are about deaths or forced arrests or torture, but I keep wondering how I would feel if you were just stopped at a checkpost and your mother or your father was slapped or beaten up, or your husband was just humiliated just casually, or your, not necessarily husband, I mean anybody who you were with, or you were, you know. So that kind of thing does happen in prisons. You know, it happens, it's like a kind of prison memoir that you could write about that sort of daily humiliation, where you're told this is the hierarchy and this is who you will bow your head to, regardless of what you think or don't think. You know, they won't think anything of putting out a news item saying, oh, this boy was shot because he didn't stop when we asked him to stop. But David, I just want to say that, you know, the wars that India has waged, the Indian government has waged on the edges of this country, in Kashmir, in Manipur, in Nagaland, in Mizoram and Assam, since ever India was independent, these wars have been waged. But now Kashmir is not the only place where there are checkposts and bunkers and killings and humiliation. That war has spread to the heart of this country. So if, in a way, if, you know, it's almost as though Kashmir, if India doesn't you know, if India doesn't even want to consider, or let's say the Indian state doesn't want to consider or address the conversations that are coming out of Kashmir, sometimes, you know, the messages on those stones, then Kashmir is, you know, India is becoming Kashmir in some ways, you know, the militarization, the repression, all of that is spreading to the whole country.
Why isn't Kashmir getting more international attention?
Good question. I mean, when the uprisings happened in Egypt, and when people, you know, moved into Tahrir Square, I, being somebody who's sort of followed the ways in which the international media reports things, began to wonder why does it choose some uprisings and not others? Because the bravery of people, whether it's in Egypt or whether it's in Kashmir or whether it's in the Congo or whatever is going on, you know, one is not questioning that. But why will the international Western media in particular pick up one and switch the lights off on the other? That's really the question, you know. And as we saw in Egypt, you had, you know, this kind of breathless reporting about this move for democracy, and then the headlines actually said, Egypt is free, military rule. You know, now we have military rule. But why will they not talk about Kashmir and talk about Egypt? I think it's just geopolitics, isn't it? You know, Egypt is so important for the Americans and the Western establishment to control, because without Egypt, the siege of Gaza doesn't exist. And you know that Hosni Mubarak, if you read the papers from a few months ago, he was ill, he was dying. There had to be a replacement. There was going to be a real problem during the handover of power. So I don't think that necessarily they'll succeed, but I think the attempt is to kind of use that energy in a sort of controlled fission experiment. But in Kashmir right now, basically the you know, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India equation, it vaults over Kashmir, you know. So it's not something that the international world, the world of corporations, the world of markets, the world of even strategic geopolitics sees as something that's going to change the status quo. You know, there are deals being made. The West needs Pakistan very badly. It cannot do anything with Afghanistan unless Pakistan is on board. And yet it needs India badly for two reasons. One is the great, huge, big market. and the other is as a very willing fallback for a presence in South Asia, given the rise of China and things, a stable and willing ally right now that should not be ignored. So to annoy India on Kashmir is not something that strategically suits the Western powers right now.
A week before candidate Obama was elected in 2008, he announced that Kashmir would be among his critical tasks. So 2 questions about that. How was that comment received in Delhi? And what has Obama done since then to follow up? He was in India in November of 2010.
Well, that comment was treated with absolute and righteous outrage by the Indian establishment. And I think it was made very clear to him or to anybody who says anything about Kashmir internationally that the Indian establishment will use everything in its power to make sure that people back down. And Obama backed down. He came here at the time when the streets of Kashmir were full of young people calling for Azadi, when already many people had been killed, and he said nothing. So Azadi
is freedom. Talk a little bit about post-colonial states, not just India, but for example, Frantz Fanon, who was so active in the resistance in Algeria to oust the French. He wrote that we don't want to change white policemen for brown or black ones. He was talking about a fundamental change in power. Nevertheless, Algeria evolved into a tyrannical state, not the state that the revolution was dreaming of.
That's the thing, David. Now you're not allowed to use that word revolution anymore. It's sort of passé, and they'll tell you that you're an old socialist with dead dreams, And that word has passed out of the political lexicon in some ways. But if you look at India, I think what is quite fascinating is that I began to think about this when I was actually in the forest with the comrades. People accuse the Maoists in India of believing in what they call protracted war, and they do believe in it. But I was thinking about what is protracted war, and the fact that from the moment India became independent, it began a protracted war, and that war has been fought since 1947 in Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Kashmir, Hyderabad, Goa, Telangana, of course later the Punjab, and now they're planning to, they announced Operation Green Hunt last year, and there is a situation of war in the heart of India. And who are these people, that have had war declared on them again and again and again? And if you look at it, they are either the people of Manipur, Nagaland, and Mizoram and so on, largely tribal people. Many of them are Christians. Jammu and Kashmir, in Kashmir it's been, a Muslim population that has borne the brunt of it. In Telangana it was largely tribal. Against the Naxalites in the 68 uprising, also it was largely tribal. Poor Dalit tribal, in Hyderabad again, it was the Muslims. In Goa, it was the Christians. So you see somehow a pattern of an upper caste Hindu state waging war continuously on the other, you know. When there's a problem like there was, let's say, in Bombay in 93 or in Gujarat in 2002, then the security forces are on the side of the people who are doing the killing, you know, as we know happened in Gujarat. So what does this say about post-colonial states? You know, today what we see very clearly in India, I mean, I've said this again and again, is that I don't know any longer what you mean when you say India this or India that, you know. You see a situation where the middle and upper classes have seceded into outer space, and there is the elites of the world are acting together against an increasingly disempowered mass of people in the world, and you see how cleverly things are twisted. You know, when you say India, like constantly people will say to me, "Oh, you know, you are very unpopular in India," because the elite and the establishment appropriates that title. They are India, you know. And then the games, like for example, Kashmir, they this summer, what was the slogan? It was "Go India, Go." That slogan has been appropriated for the World Cup for cricket. "Go India, Go." You know, it's just been totally leached of meaning and become the opposite of what people meant it as. You know, so. The post-colonial state, even the name of the country, like the name board outside your office, has been taken over by the elite. You know, and I'll say this, that I think that the struggle in Kashmir, the people in Kashmir, the fight that's going on there, one of the attempts has been to isolate them, you know, to put them into a ghetto and make them live in an intellectual and political ghetto where anybody with any ideas, any vision, any sense of leadership is shot and jailed and disappeared. However, that's obviously the technique which all repressive regimes use. But that struggle has to get out of its ghetto and make alliances with what's going on in the rest of the world, not just in India, but in the rest of the world. You know, that will lead to a kind of political maturity, where you yourself don't fall into the trap of falling into the conventional understanding of a nation state, you know.
And one of the characteristics of post-colonial states is the manipulation of oppressed minorities. For example, Kashmiris are sent to police and patrol in Chhattisgarh, and people from the northeast are sent to Kashmir to do the exact same thing.
Well, that's also something that I've written about. You know, that India acts just like a colonial state. You know, just like Indians were sent to Iraq and to all over the place to fight Britain's wars for it, and you'll see the sort of unknown Indian soldier buried all over the world fighting for empire. And even within India, if you look at it historically, the historical battles fought in, even if you look at 1857, you know, the Indian, whatever people call it, the mutiny, some people call it the first freedom struggle, you will see that's exactly what happened. I mean, how many British soldiers were there in India? Not that many. But for instance, in 1857, the Sikhs fought on the side of the British, you know, in the ransacking of Delhi. But today India does that. It sends the Nagas to Chhattisgarh, it sends the Chhattisgarhis to Kashmir, it sends the Kashmiris to Orissa, and in this way it, and constantly, even in today's papers, you'll see the fronting of, look at all these Kashmiris, they actually want to join the army, they actually want to join the police, and there's a sort of humiliation, Yesterday's papers had the fact that the valley's people quietly accept compensation. So what happens, you kill, somebody's killed by the security forces, then even to take compensation for that killing is wrong. Then if you were to take help from, let's say, not that help is forthcoming, I think that's a limitation of the movement in Kashmir, that they have not supported each other post killing or something. But if they did, that would have been wrong too. So everything is wrong, It's not a double bind, it's a triple bind or a quadruple bind, and everything is used to humiliate you, not just torture or killing, but psychologically and in every sort of way.
The popular refrain from the Indian government is that Kashmir is an integral part of India, and atut ang, I think is the phrase in Hindi. And the Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, who was finance minister in the early 1990s when neoliberal so-called reforms were introduced in India, acknowledged that there has been, quote, some turbulence in Kashmir, but things were now, again, quote, under control. And then he went on to say that there would be no replication of the Middle East events. Why? He said, because India is a functioning democracy. Now, there's a lot of formulaic expressions, obviously, when politicians talk, but there's also something, I think, very deeply revealed about the justification that the state has to remain in Kashmir.
Well, if you look at it, this idea of India being a functioning democracy and that the events of the Middle East will not be replaced, all of it is just based on much of it is just based on falsehoods and on a assertion rather than any kind of real analysis, to begin with, why should the head of a functioning democracy never have won an election in his life is a good question. From there we can start. From the history of what Kashmir's relationship is to India politically and geographically and all of that. But see, these are not the reasons why they may or may not be a replication of that situation. The reason that there may not be a replication of that situation next summer is that there's a huge crackdown going on. Hundreds of young people are being caught and put into jail. There's talk of shutting down Facebook. There's police going around just intimidating people, burning things, breaking villages, breaking people's window panes, in a place where the temperature can be minus 30. You can imagine what that means. So there will be no, if there isn't a replication, it's not because it's a functioning democracy, but because it's a functioning military occupation, And to say that India is a functioning democracy, I would say that there are certainly parts of India like Greater Kailash in Delhi or Vasant Vihar or Jorbagh or Green Park where we are now, which is a functioning democracy, but it's not a functioning democracy in Dantewada. It's not a functioning democracy in Kashmir, nor in Manipur, nor in Orissa, nor in Jharkhand, nor in Chhattisgarh. In fact, I would ask that Prime Minister of ours one question. If an ordinary person, let's say an ordinary tribal person in a village in Chhattisgarh, had been treated unjustly By unjustly, we just mean, if a few of his family members had been killed, or his daughter had been raped by a security force. Which institution in this country can a poor person appeal to in order for us to call it a democracy? Which institution? There is not one left now.
Well, given the level of opposition to its rule in Kashmir, what keeps India there?
A whole lot of things, one thing I think is that both India and Pakistan have a great vested interest now in keeping Kashmir on the boil. A vested interest that range from political to actually material, to have 700,000 soldiers there. You can imagine the amount of money that's poured into that occupation and what's going on with that money. Property, concertina wire, petrol, vehicles, power, the power to control a population like that, the business deals with the collaborators and the local elites. It's like running a little country. Why would anybody want to give that up, That's one thing. The other thing is that, oddly enough, it's just become such a question of the national ego that to rethink that position when you're so far down into the tunnel would require a great amount of vision. Then you have a situation where political parties, let's say in India, are vying with each other to, like, if the Congress that's in power now were to do anything that remotely resembled something progressive, the BJP would immediately try and capitalize on it, so it doesn't have any space, so this democracy doesn't have any space to maneuver in that sense, because it's a democracy, and the other party is just waiting to capitalize on the poisonous publicity that you've already used to keep this machine going. So there are a lot of reasons why, and yet today I think that one of the really big problems that the state faces is that after very many years, there are fissures in the consensus amongst Indian people, and those fissures have come because people have seen this sort of undeniably mass democratic unarmed protest day after day after year in Kashmir, and people are affected by it in India. They are not easily able to say, oh, these are militants, these are Islamists, these are Taliban, So there's been a fracturing of that, and both in the case of the war in Chhattisgarh, Orissa and Jharkhand, and in the case of places like Kashmir and even Manipur to some extent, the fact is that the state is very well aware of the fact that massive consensus is a bit shaky. There are cracks, and serious ones.
A journalist in Kashmir told me that over the last several years, top Israeli military and intelligence officials have been visiting Kashmir. What are they doing there?
David, I think that the US is very aware of the fact that Pakistan is on very shaky ground. I mean, we know it's a nuclear power. We know that Afghanistan is, the whole adventure in Afghanistan is on the skids. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to get out. They want to get out, I think, but they don't know how to get out even now. You have the rise of China. You have a huge stake in the gas fields of Central Asia, and you have Pakistan, an old ally that's on the skids, partly because of your own history of intervention, or let's say, I would say almost wholly because of that. Pakistan was never allowed to administer its own affairs ever since it became a reality. So that country has not been allowed to develop democratic institutions. At least India was allowed to, and now it's kind of hollowing them out. But Pakistan was never allowed to. So now the US needs, in this battle, it needs to step back onto surer ground. It needs a new frontier because that Pakistan frontier is collapsing. And I think that that's what's going on. That how do we now build a retreat in Ladakh, in Kashmir, in these areas, where it's a fallback plan,
And the Israeli involvement?
That's the same as the American involvement. Where's the difference between Israel? I mean, the Israelis and the Indians are now thick,
Well, the U.S. conducts more military exercises.
Apart from the fact that, the usual thing about India being I think one of the biggest purchasers of weapons now, and with the economy being what it is, how important it is for them to sell these weapons, to ratchet up the insecurities in a way. And it's odd, because they're stuck in a cycle where you create a situation where you need to sell these weapons, even in the Middle East and even here. And then at some point that situation gets the better of you.
The United States conducts more military exercises with India than any other country in the world. The New York Times, when Obama was visiting here in November of 2010, announced that the country is turning into, quote, one of the world's most lucrative arms markets, and Obama arrives here with 200 executives, top U.S. corporate executives in tow, signs a deal for a Boeing C-17 cargo plane worth $5 billion, and there are many more arms deals in the offing, all to sate, again, what the New York Times calls India's appetite for more sophisticated weaponry has grown.
Yeah, India's appetite certainly has grown, and partly that appetite has to do with pleasing the masters, because I want to know when the last time was that they used any of these sophisticated weapons, and who are they going to use them against? Can they use any sophisticated weapons in a war against China or against Pakistan? They can't, because it's, these are all now nuclear armed countries. And the great irony is that the more sophisticated these weapons that this military industrial complex develops, the less the real threats are from conventional warfare, and the threats that are coming from terrorism are threats that cannot be addressed with sophisticated weapons, with tanks, with torpedoes, with any of that. Certainly what is going on, I think, is that all countries, and I'm sure India is right on top of the pile, have a huge appetite for weapons of surveillance and spying and things like that. But conventional weapons for conventional warfare, it's just, I think the greatest use that they put it to is to have them parade up and down Rajpath on Republic Day, or just to sort of a sort of narcissistic show rather than for any practical use. A country that spends billions and billions and billions on these weapons, while 800 million people live on less than 20 rupees a day.
20 rupees a day is about 50 cents in U.S. currency. In fact, India, or that India, you know, the India that is essentialized, the one that the West identifies with, is constantly lauded and praised as new billionaires are added to the Forbes list. But Utsa Patnaik, an economist at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, says there's a deep agricultural depression in the country. Farmer suicides are at unbelievable levels because of indebtedness. And there's been correspondingly a sharp decline in grain output and grain consumption. So there's the Republic of Hunger is actually the title of one of Utsa Patnaik's books.
But that's, you know, that's what I sometimes think, that if you look at a country where, as I said, more than 800 million people live on less than 20 rupees a day, you have more poor people in India than 7 of the poorest African countries put together. And we have this litany of, you know, issues. We have 200,000 farmers who have killed themselves because they've gone into debt. You have increasing ecological and environmental crises. You have wars breaking out, all of that. And yet this kind of cabaret goes on. I actually spoke to some people, some correspondents of major Western publications. And they told me that they have strict instructions, no bad stories about India, because India is the finance destination, you know, for the rest of the world. So you have people looking to India to revitalize their economies, and you have an Indian government which has just become so servile that it doesn't any longer know what's good for it. And you have a situation where, leaving aside these wars in Kashmir and Manipur, which are a different kind of war, you know, there are battles for identity and nationhood and so on. But the other battle is in some ways a battle that concerns the rest of the world, because it's not just a battle for survival of millions of people, it's also a battle for ideas of the future of the world and what it's going to be. And what you have is somebody like Chidambaram, the Home Minister, who used to be the Finance Minister from Harvard Business School, you know, directly in line with the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia, that kind of IMF imagination, saying that he visualizes an India in which more than 70% of its people live in the cities, which is something like 500 million people. He expects that they should be on the move. They cannot be moved unless it becomes a military state. And then a couple of years later, that same minister says that the migrants in cities carry a kind of criminal behavior that's unacceptable in modern cities, you know, so they have to be policed, and and you have judges and all these kinds of people basically sanitizing India against the poor. And there isn't any place for poor people to plant their feet anymore. And we're not talking about a minority, you know, we're not talking about the few homeless people, not the few, but there are hundreds of homeless people I know, but here we are talking of a majority of people in this country who have no place in the country. They have no place in the imagination, they have no place in the institutions, they have no place in the law. They have a few bones thrown at them, like the National Employment Guarantee Act, but that too generates a kind of capital that you know, middlemen siphon off. So you're really heading for a kind of crisis which I don't think any of the people who are in charge of this country have a handle on.
In your essay, The Trickle-Down Revolution, you write that the real power in the country has passed into the hands of a coven of oligarchs, judges, bureaucrats, and politicians. They in turn are run like prize racehorses by the few corporations who more or less own everything in the country. They may belong to different political parties and put up a great show of being political rivals, but that's just subterfuge for public consumption. The only real rivalry is the business rivalry between corporations.
Remember, David, that I wrote this before the expose of the Radia tapes. And in the Radia tapes, this is like a diagnosis which was confirmed by MRIs. You know, it's just unbelievable that the battle, now we're in a very interesting phase in India where the corporations are battling each other and therefore leaking news about each other to the press. But in the Radia tapes, which of course were the phone taps by the phones of this woman called Neera Radia, who's the sort of PR person for Mukesh Ambani as well as for the Ratan Tata Group, which both are the biggest corporations in this country. And in those conversations came out the fact that they are running everybody. They are deciding who the minister should be, and the sale of spectrum. In this case, of course, it was just telecom spectrum, which was sold by the government to these companies, and in turn by these companies for huge amounts of money. I mean, beyond belief, billions of dollars. But in the case of natural resources, whether it's water, whether it's minerals, and so on, the same thing is happening with an enormous human cost, So it's like, I'll tell you what's interesting about what's happening in India. It's not unlike what has happened historically in Africa or in Latin America, in Colombia, in Argentina. It's not unlike that, except that it's overlaid with this grid of a fast becoming farcical democracy. So that's what's new, and that's why it's very interesting to analyze it. Otherwise, the loot, the hollowing out, it happened in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. The privatization of everything has led to Russia being basically ruled by mafia, because it generates such a huge amount of hot capital that you can buy everybody, or have those who you can't buy incarcerated or put away. So India, none of these things are unique in a sense. What's happening is not unique. However, given the history of this country and given the rhetoric of democracy and the new era of climate change and all of that, that's what's interesting about it. How do you continue to do what you've done for centuries, but how do you fit it in to it's all right. In those days, the Western world was democratic and it was developing the ideas of civil rights and so on, and it was colonizing and committing genocide in other countries. Now you have both those things superimposed on each other. You have India colonizing itself, you have India developing its own ideas of civil rights, and yet needing to commit a kind of slow genocide on people, where you're not lining them up and killing them, surely, but you're starving them, you're slowly cutting them off from their resources, you're encircling them, you're calling the army out, and it's all superimposed. It's not geographically this country doing it to this country, but the elites of one country doing it to the poor of its own poor.
And there's a kind of lexical framework in which this takes place, such terms as public-private partnerships, memorandums of understanding, and special economic zones.
Yeah, I mean, and of course people have their own versions of that, slavery empowered zones, or special whatever, I've forgotten all the word, euphemism.
Exploitation zones.
Yeah, special exploitation zones and so on. But the point is that now in India, really in some ways the great debates are over, because those debates were taking place 10 years ago when people were protesting about privatization and other people were insulting those of us who talked about it and said, what do you want us to live in a bullock cart age, or, you know. But today everybody knows that it's banditry. The divisions are only on what you're prepared to do about it and how you're going to fight it. And those are the divisions that exist, you know, some between people.
So they're tactical, not strategic.
No, they are tactical and strategic, not ideological, not in terms of exactly what you're opposing. So the resistance movements in this country, ranging from the Gandhians to the socialists to the Maoists, are all fighting the same things, but their strategies of resistance are different. And surely their ideologies are different, but a lot of the difference has to do with also somehow it has to do with the geography of where the site of resistance is. You can't fight in the jungle the way you fight in an open plain in the villages and so on, you know.
Well, in your essay, Walking with the Comrades, of the time you spent in the forests of Chhattisgarh with what are called alternately Maoists or Naxalites in that area, what kind of fundamental change are they proposing in terms of restructuring the society?
See, they are pretty straightforward in that they are communists, you know, and they believe in overthrowing the Indian state with violence. They believe in the rule of the proletariat and so on. But right now, the place where they're fighting from and the people they're fighting, I mean, not the people they're fighting with, they are all 99.9% of them are all Adivasi people. So Adivasi, by Adivasi, of course, I mean, you know, indigenous people, tribal people. And that brings a different color to the nature of this battle. You know, a lot of those people have never ever been outside the forest. They've never seen a bus or a train or a small town, let alone Delhi or, you know, a big city. So right now, I would say that the battle right now is that in these huge areas where the indigenous people of this country live, the government, quite against its own constitution, has signed hundreds of memorandums of understanding to turn that land over to private corporations for mining, for bauxite, for iron ore, for every kind of other mineral. So right now the contours of the battle, even though ultimately they believe in a different society, and they do have a pretty conventional idea of the nation, which I don't share. But right now it's really a battle to just stop those lands from being taken over, to stop the annihilation of a way of life, which today is the only surviving way of life that can have any claims to being sustainable. You know, it's in great threat. People are starving, people are ill, people are malnutrition, but they still, I mean, that is because there's been such an endless assault on them, you know, but they still do have the tools and the wisdom to teach us something about how to live and how we are going to have to live in the future. It's not that we all have to become tribal people, but we have to learn to re-understand what civilization means.
I can hear anchors on news TV and the critics who carpet you saying, there goes Arundhati again, you know, romanticizing tribals.
You know, the interesting thing is that if you go in there and if you read what I've written, the thing that I really thought was very, very interesting about my experience walking with the comrades in the forest, was that is one thing that they did not do. They did not go in there and say, oh, this is a perfect society and they're so egalitarian and they're so beautiful and let's all be like this. They didn't. They went in there and there were so many things that they looked at. And to me, what struck me most was the relationship between men and women within those tribal communities. And at the cost of not having easy acceptance, they worked there. They spoke about what they thought of, their ideas of justice. And today, 45% of the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army consists of women, tribal women. And I spoke to many of them. And many of them joined because they were reacting to the patriarchy of their own very conventional communities. You know, so the battle within that area, forgetting about the overthrow of the state or the new corporations that have come in, those are new things, you know. Historically, the tribal people, especially tribal women, have been just considered the natural trophy of forest department officials, government officials, police who just go in there and pick up who they like, rape who they like. Today, that cannot happen. So, in a sense, they've already won. You know, they've already won huge victories of dignity and things. So, to say romanticizing is also, you see, it's also, you know, when you're threatened by arguments and by actual war, you have to find ways of undermining, you have to find ways of labeling, of delegitimizing. So it's all a part of that, you know. But in actual fact, the real thing is that there was no romanticizing, which is why there's so much strength, you know. There was a very clear idea of justice.
Operation Green Hunt is the government program, military operation to crush the Maoist rebellion. You say that that the Operation Green Hunt actually did a favor by clarifying the situation for people. Could you elaborate on that?
You know, the thing is that, you know, to go back to what I was saying to you earlier, the fact that, you know, this kind of exploitation of indigenous people and this sort of open genocide that happened in countries like Africa in you know, in the early parts of the last century and so on, we know about. You know, we know about the slaughter and the genocide and so on. Now, what's interesting, as I said, is that you have this constitution and this democracy superimposed. So you have to do things quietly. You can't be as brazen as people were in those days. So you have things in our constitution which are trying to make up for the completely colonial attitude to tribal people in post-independence India, even in the constitution. So you have a new law, for example, called the Panchayat Extension of Scheduled Areas Act, PESA, it's called, which disallows the government from taking over tribal land and handing it over to companies. But in spite of this, the Prime Minister himself, the Home Minister himself, comes out and says, this is what we have to do, you know. So what Operation Green Hunt did is to you know, so the existence of this law in the which has become a part of the Constitution, and then this business of we need to progress and we need the minerals and so on, it smokes up the mirrors, you know. And Operation Green Hunt clarified things to local people, very, very clear. Okay, here's the policeman, he has a gun and he wants your village and he wants your land and he wants your house. You want to give it or you want to fight? In that way, it clarified things, you know. I mean, I'm just being very schematic about it, but now, you know, often people who are, you know, in urban areas who've been thinking about these things, we get wind of things really early, you know. Like, say you're talking about a dam. It takes years and years for the actual effects of that dam, once it's constructed, to come and affect people. And if you're trying to be an early warning system, you have a lot of work because people can also believe, oh, that river, it's our, you know, devta, aur usko kabhi nahi bandha ja sakta hai, you know. You can even have to deal with something like that. So in this way, you know, the soldiers stepped out of the corporate boardroom and said, okay, now it's war.
The river is a goddess and it can never be dammed up. You found an anonymous quote from England. The law locks up the hapless felon who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose. This kind of encapsulates much of what you've been describing.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that was at the time, obviously, of the enclosure of the commons, when that poem was written. Here, it's the enclosure and corporatization of the commons. You know, it's not just the enclosure, but the enclosure and the destruction of the commons simultaneously. That's going on. And a destruction which I think even the middle class, who has so far benefited greatly from the opening up of the markets and the creation of an Indian middle class, has now suddenly, slowly, very, very slowly, but there's an unease, you know. People know that eventually you're pissing in the pond. You know, eventually you're soiling your own nest, and that's not going to get you very far. And that, I think, is why we are in such a interesting time. You know, a few years ago, the things that some of us were saying, now with the exposure of the radio tapes, everybody knows it, you know. So I almost feel like I can sort of put my feet up and sit back now and think about doing something else, because you know, it's street talk. What we were yelling about earlier is street talk now.
The case of Binayak Sen has attracted a lot of international attention. 40 Nobel Prize winners have called for his release. What does he represent in a country where there is so much injustice? Why is his particular case worthy of attention?
I think it represents the fact that the rot and the injustice and the fear that just stalked a certain class is now breached a barrier, and it's coming into, you know, who's Binayak Sen? He's a velour doctor. He's a person who an ordinary middle class Indian would think has done a great thing, you know, by giving up a lucrative middle class life and working among the poorest of the poor. And if you're going to go after him, as far as the state is concerned, once again, I think very clearly it's sending out a signal that I keep calling it the sort of urban avatar of Operation Green Hunt. You know, they know how to deal with the Maoists in the forest. They know how to fire into crowds of unarmed villagers in, you know, protesting in small, you know, towns or villages. How are you going to deal with the middle class person who disagrees, you know, and who has the ability, the power, the education, the skills of communication to make other people, powerful people, status quoist, look at things in another way. Binayak Sen was the first person to blow the whistle on the Salwa Judum, you know, the government militia that was unleashed in the forests of Chhattisgarh, very much at the behest of the government and some corporations, to clear the ground, you know, to do what we call, what the British General Briggs called strategic hamleting. when they were fighting the communists in Malaysia, of terrorizing populations and making them move into roadside camps and clearing the land. So that's what the Salwa Judum was doing in Chhattisgarh, and Vinayak was one of the people who raised an alarm and spoiled things for them. And that's why Operation Green Hunt was announced, because the sort of Salwa Judum style strategic hamleting thing didn't work.
I'm interested to note that, in spite of all of what you've been saying about the depredations of the Indian state, the shrinking of public space for dissent, that you write that here in India, even in the midst of all the violence and greed, there is still immense hope. Where do you find that hope?
I find it in the fact that people, like if you look at what's happening, I talked about these massive numbers of MOUs that have been signed with multinational companies for mineral exploitation, and yet those MOUs were signed in 2005 and it's 2011, and the protests have increased, they've been repressed, there are hundreds of people in jail, but they are not managing to actualize most of them, So I don't think there are many places in the world where the world's richest and biggest corporations, with a state that completely colludes with them, are being unable to get what they want. And that, through all the disagreements and arguments and within resistance movements about violence and non-violence and armed struggle and Gandhian protest, whatever it is, eventually between them they have stopped people. It's a very fragile standoff, but it's there and we have to salute it, And I hope that it coincides with the time in which people all over the world are beginning to understand, because of not just the debates, but because of the obvious, because of the obvious sort of onset of climate change, are going to understand that things can't go on like this, And maybe they will go on like this, in which case there will be a complete collapse. But the point is that at least we'll go down fighting, at least we'll go down saying that we'll do everything to stop this. And I think that is a tremendously hopeful thing.
Well, are the solutions to the problems created by the masters going to come from the masters?
They're not, because in fact I had gone to Harvard. I did a lecture in Harvard recently. It was called "Can We Leave the Bauxite in the Mountain?" And part of me was sort of thinking that the real effect I would like this lecture to have is to make them feel sort of deprived and helpless, the masters of the universe who are there, because the solutions are not going to come from the people who created the problem in the first place. I'm not saying everyone in Harvard, but what I mean is the sort of the pinnacle of the establishment in some ways. And I think that I think that this whole idea of how you look for a solution too needs to be talked about, because there can be a very imperialistic understanding of that solution. You have an imperial vision that created the problem, and you want an imperial vision that comes up with an imperial solution. It's not going to happen, You have to be able to, look at it in fractured ways. You have to pay respect to the fact that different ecosystems and different people and different kinds of situations will have different problems. And it's not going to be a broad spectrum antibiotic that will create the solution. And surely it's not going to be a solution that voluntarily comes from some climate change conference in Copenhagen. It's not going to happen. It's going to have to be forced on people. And the beginning of that, for me, has to be a fight to protect places physically and cultures physically where there is the practice of a new imagination, or an old imagination that could become a new imagination without going through the horrors of what we call civilization.
You've become, whether you like it or not, the de facto chronicler of descent from Kashmir to Chhattisgarh, and a lot of people are interested in how you work. They asked me to ask you, you know, what is her writing routine like? How does she organize material? Do you have a process that you follow?
None whatsoever. I just have a. Someone asked me this question actually recently. They asked me, how do you go about doing the kind of research that you need to write your pieces? And I said, I don't do research to write my pieces. I just keep myself informed in order to get over the indignity of living in a pool of propaganda. And then when you understand what the real story is, you're so angry that you have to write something, because I don't research things in order to write. But I think it's just I think it's just something that's in my DNA, maybe, just the idea of how do these things connect up, and how do resist. Like, I don't think that you can just assume things like the people are always right and resistance is always wonderful and people's movements are great, because they are not, and you can have greatly unpleasant and almost sometimes repulsive political assumptions. The greatest people's movement in this country was the Bajrang Dal and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, like while we talk of hope and so on.
Those are right-wing Hindu nationalist formations.
Yes, and recently there was a march of millions of them in Madhya Pradesh, like a flag march through Christian and tribal and Muslim areas, sort of warning people, that this is the new way. And the truth is that, some yogi or some obscurantist person can attract 10 lakh people to learn a yoga asana, and not that many are listening to us, so we can't have too much of a jumped up notion of who we are either.
Well, it seems as a trained architect, you've brought some of that discipline to the work you're doing today in terms of deconstructing things and then putting them back together.
I don't know, David. I don't want to, I try not to comment on my own work, in terms of what I'm trying to do. Eventually it's there in what I write, and hopefully it manages to communicate a certain urgency.
I remember in one of the earliest interviews we ever did, perhaps in the very place that we're sitting in now, in Green Park in New Delhi, you talked about the danger of being a tall poppy, of standing out, of being visible and fighting the silence. You've attracted a lot of animosity and hatred, and are you ever worried, or do you find yourself inhibited in any way because of fear?
Well, David, that's a good question. Am I worried? I would be stupid not to be worried. I would be stupid not to be aware of what's going on. So I won't say that I'm not worried. But what's happened, once again, to come back to the idea of this, how do you play these things out while you're pretending to be a democracy? So in many ways, the infrastructure of democracy has been the upper infrastructure has been rented out to the corporates, and the lower infrastructure has been rented out to the mob. So you have now wherever I go, wherever I speak, and I've been traveling a lot and speaking a lot to rather huge audiences, and the Hindu right tries to make sure that there's always some, Bajrang Dal or some kind of protest, physically threaten me and all that. And then there's this thing of trying to ensnare you in a sort of legal morass where you have court cases against you, and you have that kind of thing they're trying to do. So far, nothing serious has happened, but they're piling up.
But nothing serious has happened in legal terms, but your house was attacked in New Delhi.
Yeah, no, I meant in legal terms, nothing serious has happened, but there is this constant threat. Right now there's this attempt to charge me with sedition, but the police themselves are reluctant to go ahead with it because, there's that trade-off all the time. If you do that, you're going to internationalize the Kashmir issue in a way. So, in a way, we are playing for high stakes, and it's something which I think I should not be blasé about. But at the same time, when you see what ordinary people are going through, and the threats and the horrors of people's prison experiences, and of torture, and of death, and of the poorest people in this country, can you imagine? I mean, people who live from hand to mouth, being picked up and put in jail, and how are they ever going to get a lawyer or get out of prison, and how are their families going to survive? So, just one little look around, and you get a little steel in your spine, thinking, come on, let's not feel sorry for ourselves here.
And how is that world-famous organization, Sweethearts International, doing?
The Sweethearts International Network is in good shape, yeah, it's in very good shape.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve.